Hello ladies and germs, welcome back. Today we're just going to do like a brief overview of the opening sequence of No Country for Old Men. We've done it in class, so I kind of don't want to do, I don't want to go into the massive amounts of detail that we did in class. I'm just going to try and give you an overview of some of the key points to aid the revision that you're doing at the moment. So, as ever, now would be a good time. Go and watch the opening sequence again, go through your notes again, and then back here and we'll start going through it. Cheers guys! Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the cinematography. Cinematography, we get a series of these kind of like very wide establishing shots filmed on a 10mm lens, obviously accentuated through the 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio to give it this kind of epic quality. This is a reference to the work, perhaps an intertextual reference to the work of John Ford, who is one of the key Western filmmakers and who kind of was very kind of like recognizable by his use of wide cinematic landscapes on wide-angle lenses like so. And also, one of the other things we can say about it is that it kind of progresses, the establishing shots progress in terms of time, in terms of development. Okay, so we start with almost nothing, we start at dawn, and we could be at any point in American history, and this is really important for No Country for Old Men, because remember, this is a film that's set in the 80s, in 1980, it's released in 2007, but its opening shot could be from the start of American civilization, and it's setting out its stall in terms of what it's aiming to do from a socio-political, historical perspective. It's a story about America, all of America, and so it takes its opening shot and places it at the very, very start, at the start of the day, at a point in time which is not fixed, as if to say to us, this is about then and now. Okay, it's about the entirety of America. It's going to say something about that. So that's really important. And as the shots progress, we get the kind of increase through the mise-en-scène. We then get increase through the props and the set design, the production design, the introduction of civilization. So we get the fences. This idea that suddenly this land is now being partitioned and divided, and we get the introduction of like the windmill spinning round, which is again an intertextual reference to Once Upon a Time in the West, but it's also this introduction of civilization until we eventually end up with the police car and the law, and we've developed, and again we've been brought up to speed in terms of the development of America. Okay, let's talk briefly about sound in the opening. Okay, if we look at two aspects of sound, in terms of the diegetic and the non-diegetic. I suppose let's just focus on the non-diegetic for now. We've got the voiceover. So the non-diegetic narrative voiceover. Okay, and this is from the perspective of Sheriff Bell, Tommy Lee Jones's character. And what's interesting about this is a number of different things. First of all, we can tie it in with the rest of the Coen's oeuvre, the idea that this is a recurring feature in their work, that they often use voiceover, but they often do it in a kind of subversive way. So quite often a voiceover used in a film implies to us like the voice of God, the voice of wisdom, a kind of wiser, older voice that kind of sees everything, a kind of omnipresence, okay? And we, as an audience, just immediately imbue that with some kind of wisdom and knowledge and power that they understand. There's an overview at place. And the Coen Brothers kind of often take that and subvert it by giving us a voiceover from a character who's an idiot, or who doesn't know what's going on, or who is perhaps misguided, or someone that we shouldn't necessarily trust. So we see that in films like The Big Lebowski, we see that in films like Raising Arizona, and we see it here. It's less obvious here. They're playing a kind of a far more dangerous game in terms of this, because Tommy Lee Jones as an actor, his star persona is someone that we kind of trust in, that we can see as a kind of, he often plays a hero, he often plays someone that we trust, a morally good person. He's older, he's wiser. that's what we kind of associate with him. Kind of a similar star persona to somebody like Morgan Freeman, who the audience just immediately goes, well, I will trust what this man says. And he's also a sheriff, he's a lawman, he's placed within the narrative as a heroic figure. And what we learn across the narrative, of course, is that he doesn't know what's going on and he can't solve the crime, and he is a hypocrite, and he does have an inability to look forward, and he can't figure out what's gone wrong, not only in his own life, in his own work, but also in America in a broader cultural context. And so what we have is a voiceover that seems like it's a voice of reason and guidance and wisdom, but is in fact a voiceover by a lost, kind of confused older man who's adrift in this new America. So they subvert the usual use of a voiceover in this way. The other thing that we can say about the sound, the non-diegetic sound, is the lack of it. Okay, all the way through the film we have barely any non-diegetic score at all. There's a little in this opening sequence towards the end. There are occasional moments in the film where we get this kind of low synth kind of rumble or a hum, but that's about it. And what's really interesting about this is that the Coen Brothers are refusing to guide our emotions and to also to morally guide us. Usually a non-diegetic score does those two things. It tells us how we're supposed to feel emotionally, and it also gives us a kind of moral perspective. It kind of tells us when the good guy is doing something good, and it tells us when the bad guy is about to do something bad. And by removing the non-diegetic score, we're left in this kind of moral grey area. It's kind of almost what Tarantino does in Reservoir Dogs, but the opposite way of achieving the same thing. So he uses contrapuntal score, say in the ear slicing sequence, so that we automatically start to enjoy it, and then we have to question why we're enjoying such kind of chaotic violence. Whereas what the Coen Brothers do is they remove any score whatsoever. We have no anchor. We have no way to kind of cling on to anything in terms of no guidance as to how we should feel. And we're left with these morally ambiguous characters. A sheriff who is not able to solve the case, who is a hypocrite. We've got Chigurh, who we're kind of drawn to. He's incredibly charismatic, but is repugnant human being. So we're left in that moral quandary as well. And then Moss, who is absolutely an ambiguous anti-hero, who does good things and bad things, who is adrift in this between these two opposing forces. So the non-diegetic score aids all of this idea of what the Coen Brothers want to do, which is leave us adrift so that we have to figure things out for ourselves. And we're not used to doing that in cinema. So I want to talk a little bit about the Western genre conventions. They're introduced to us via the mise-en-scène, the production design, the props, the cinematography and the references to John Ford, the landscapes, all of these different things within the composition. So remember your film form. We're looking at props, we're looking at set design, we're looking at production design, we're looking at cinematography, we're looking at composition. All of these things indicate to us the Western genre. Even things like the character types, like the fact that we're having this non-diegetic voiceover from the perspective of the sheriff. All of these things, the Western genre. And the Coen Brothers are doing something incredibly subversive by using the Western genre to kind of ideologically explore what they're doing. Because the Western genre is one of the true American kind of inventions, the true American genres, okay? And it was often used certainly in the glory days, in the heyday of the Western, in the 40s and the 50s, as kind of thinly veiled right-wing American propaganda. And that's not to say that these filmmakers were actively setting out to do that. We're going to make a right-wing propaganda movie. It wasn't that. It was just that that's what they were. Their very nature, the way that they've been set up in their DNA, they were kind of selling this myth of America, the myth being the kind of construction of America, the kind of good white Western settlers. Okay, they're the morally good white Western settlers versus these kind of savage Native Americans, the savage Indians, okay, who would attack with savage means, and the white Western settlers, the cowboys, who would have to defend America against these kind of savages, right? And that's the kind of setup of a lot of those classic Westerns. And it's inherently racist and inherently xenophobic, inherently kind of traditionally right-wing and conservative, but that's what they were. Now, when we see the Western conventions via the film form, we automatically kind of assume those ideologies will be in there somewhere. And what the Coen Brothers do is they actively attack those ideologies, but they do it in a very subtle way. And it's what we call a covert ideology. So it's not overtly right there on the surface. They're not having the characters aren't having discussions about these things. There's no references to it within the dialogue. It's buried deep down in the fabric of the film. So you need to think of the film as a bit like a kind of ideological Trojan horse, right? What it does is it kind of smuggles itself into the consciousness dressed as a Western with all of the associations that we have of that, white Western good settlers versus the savage Native American Indians. And then what it does is it tells us a story covertly, subtly, implicitly. It tells us a story about the idea that in fact America is morally bankrupt, that it is not the white Western forces for good who are the heroes, that in fact they are not the heroes. At best, they're morally ambiguous, and at worst, they're villains, okay? And so when we follow those threads through, the idea of Sheriff Bell as this morally ambiguous figure who's kind of hypocritical, who looks back at a golden time, he's nostalgic for a golden time where America was fine, where people didn't have green hair like he talks about later, where you could kind of leave your door open, where all of the, people would say sir and ma'am, that's what he says. It's this kind of fake nostalgia. We see it all over our society today with Trump, we see it all over our society today with Brexit. It's the idea that there's a kind of a longing, a wistfulness for a time in the past where everything was better, but that time never really existed, and that's what Sheriff Bell personifies, this longing for an America. He's in mourning for an America that never existed in the first place. America was never morally good, and America was never the good guy. America has always been the bad guy, and that's what he's slowly coming to terms with across the film, although I don't know if he ever actually realises it, which is part of his tragedy. Remember that we said that final sequence between him and his brother where they talk about the death of their grandfather, who was killed by Native Americans on land that he'd built on that was previously owned by the Native Americans. And even in the telling of that story, they still don't realise that it's the grandfather who's at fault, not the Native Americans. And that's a kind of reference, again, we can link it within the mise-en-scène and production design to all of that blood that's just always on the ground, constant shots of characters looking down, shot reverse shots, eyeline matches, shots of the kind of blood on the ground, people following the tracks on the ground. And there's a number of different reasons why we get that. We see it in this opening sequence, but it's the idea that the blood on the ground is similar to what Kubrick does in The Shining, which is that America has been built essentially on a genocide. America has been built on blood, okay? And under the surface of America, under the ground, is the legacy of this violence that's just always threatening to bubble up to the surface. It can't be contained much longer. America have tried to sweep it under the carpet, tried to kind of like align values, to kind of resell a narrative about how they're the good guys, but it can't be contained. And that's why in The Shining the blood kind of bubbles up from the Native American burial ground and out into America, and it's why in No Country for Old Men the characters are always looking down and seeing blood on the ground as if it's bubbling under the surface. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Chigurh as a character, both in terms of how he's introduced to us and what he might represent and symbolise. When he's introduced to us, it's the first time that we get a kind of synchronicity between film form. So the film form up until this point has been kind of still, wide, establishing shots, no non-diegetic score at all. When Shigeru is introduced, we get our first pan, we get our first introduction of a very low, subtle non-diegetic score, okay? And then we have our first kind of character movement, which is the police officer moving Shigeru into the police car, right? And when he's introduced backlit, and as we know, that means the removal of the fill light, the removal of the key light, and just the light behind him, which turns him into a silhouette. And we've talked about this before. It's a couple of things. It turns him into, it dehumanizes the figure, and I think the Coen Brothers certainly want us to look at Shigeru as something less than or more than human. He's not a supernatural figure, but he certainly feels mythical in that sense. And that's the other thing that a silhouette can do. It can turn somebody into a symbol of something because it removes the kind of specifics of their face, the specifics of their physicality, and they become a symbol of something. So I think we absolutely have to think of Shigeru as a symbol of something, and then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is that? And when we get specifics of him as well in terms of, again, mise-en-scène, in terms of the kind of facial expression, his vocal tone, his hair and makeup, his costume design, think about what he looks like. He looks very different to those around him. First of all, he's dressed in very dark clothing within the costume design, and that's a very simple way of the Coen Brothers kind of separating him from somebody like Sheriff Bell, who wears the traditional light-coloured kind of law uniform as we go through the film. And that's a classic Western technique. Which, you know, the white hat and the black hat kind of idea, which signifies the villain to us. But then you've got this very pale and pasty complexion, and you've got these kind of ruby blood red lips. You've got this very strange kind of longish haircut. He's completely juxtaposed to his surroundings. So in terms of his facial expression, hair and makeup and costume, he's entirely juxtaposed to the set and his surroundings in a way that when we're introduced to Moss in this opening sequence, Moss is absolutely at one with the surroundings. He's exactly the same colour as the rocks that are behind him. He blends in. You can barely see him in the opening shot. He's just kind of there, like in the rock face, in the desert as part of the landscape, whereas Shigeru is absolutely not. He's apart from it. So he's something that's un-American. He's something that isn't supposed to be there, and we know that through the mise-en-scène and its juxtaposition with the set design and the composition, okay? There's a number of other things we can say about Shigeru and his introduction, the way that he looks as well. There's an androgyny to Shigeru, which is really interesting and strange. In Moss and Bell, we get a far more traditional type of American masculinity. We understand that these are men, right? And they're defined to a certain extent by their masculinity and their masculine characteristics. Shigeru is this curious androgynous mix of two extremes. The kind of blood red lips like lipstick, the pale complexion, the longish hair, also his vocal tone, the way that he talks in this kind of, it's very, very low, but it's also very breathy and almost whispered vocal tone. All of these things are kind of things what we might usually associate with femininity. So he's got this androgyny because also on the other side of that, he's got these hyper-masculine qualities. He's an incredibly aggressive, dominant and violent figure. He has this incredibly strong jawline, very low vocal tone. So he's this curious mixture, and again what it does is serve to make him stand out from the landscape, from the environment that he finds himself in. And then that leads us to ask us, well, why? Why are the Coen Brothers trying to make Shigeru stand out? Why do they want him to not blend in like Moss, like Bell? Why is he the other? Well, that's because maybe we can talk about the covert ideology of this film. Maybe what this film is doing under the surface is exploring the tensions and the fears that exist in post 9/11 America. This is 2007 that this film is released. Only 6 years after 9/11. 9/11 has completely kind of readjusted the American psyche. And now the number one fear in America at this point is the fear of extremist terrorism. And extremist terrorism is a new type of kind of terror facing American people and Western people. It's the idea that this could strike at any time, and that it has a code or a philosophy that the American public do not understand. They do not understand it. There's reason there. There's some kind of rhyme and reason there as to why these people decide to attack when they do with the randomness that they do. But the Americans aren't privy to it, this understanding. And that's terrifying because we don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to happen. And ultimately, we don't really understand why it's happening because it doesn't tally with our philosophies and our ways of looking at the universe, okay? And that's why extremist terrorism around this time is so terrifying to the American public. And that's Chagall, he is a kind of foreign entity, an other, who finds himself in the American landscape, juxtaposed to the American landscape. He's infiltrated it, he is now there, okay? And he commits these seemingly random acts of terror, these seemingly random acts of violence. He doesn't seem to discriminate with who he kills and why he kills them. And the people who he kills and the people are surrounding, they have no idea why he's doing it. They're always searching. Why do you have to do this? Why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. And he looks at them exasperated as if to say, of course I do, but I could never explain to you why. And I think the Coen Brothers are tapping into a very particular post 9/11 fear of extremist terrorism, and so we could argue that Chagall represents that. Especially if we link it to the final image we see of Chagall. He just very slowly assimilates himself into American society. Even over the course of this opening sequence, the final time we see him in the opening sequence, he's in a police car, and he pulls over an American person. He's infiltrated himself to the point that he's now part of the law enforcement, right? And by the end of the film, when he disappears after the car crash, he just kind of walks into the American suburbs and disappears very quietly, assimilated into the American suburbs. And if you think about where we meet him here on the outskirts of the American landscape, the primitive American landscape, and we look at his journey and his endpoint, disappearing quietly into the American suburbs, this symbol of fear, terrorism, extremism and violence, it's very disturbing, the idea that he just disappears, which is something really interesting to think about. Okay, I want to talk a little bit now about the shot where we have mid-shot, okay, 50mm lens, we've got the police officer in the foreground and we have Chagall in the background in the handcuffs, okay? There's a lot of interesting things we can say about this shot. First of all, the 50mm lens mimics the way that the human eye sees. So the foreground, what we're focused on, is clearer than the background. The background isn't so out of focus that we can't make out what it is, but it's not so in focus that we can kind of clearly see what it is. It's not deep focus, it's still shallow focus cinematography. The 50mm lens aids that, as does the mid-shot. And that's done for a number of reasons. I think what that does is it kind of keeps Chagall mysterious. We still haven't seen his face properly at all. So the 50mm lens allows us to identify that it is Chagall, but not in any kind of detail that would allow us to kind of like make out his facial features. He remains this mysterious killer. He's so similar to those slasher movie killers of the 80s, the way that kind of Michael Myers works. In more ways than one, the idea of this kind of like impassive, blank, pale complexion, this face that we can't read in terms of usual human emotions, and also just the idea that he's been turned into a kind of symbol of something that Americans fear at that particular point in socio kind of historical context. He's very similar to those slasher movie killers. I think Michael Myers more than anything. That last shot that we were talking about where Chagall disappears into the suburbs is so similar to shots from Halloween in terms of its composition, in terms of its mise-en-scène, in terms of its colour palette, in terms of the idea of this kind of symbol of American fear disappearing into the suburbs where Americans are supposed to feel safe. So there's so many kind of similarities in terms of that. Also, there's a bunch of similarities with the Terminator, which I'm fascinated by, and I never read about anywhere the idea that he's so similar to the character of the Terminator. The idea, and even there's so many different similarities in terms of like the way that the mise-en-scène uses motels and those dusty American landscapes, which is prominent in the Terminator. That sequence where he performs surgery on himself is so similar to many sequences where that kind of impassive, kind of destructive killer in the Terminator kind of perform surgery on himself as too. So there's a reference there as well, I think, which is really, really interesting, right? So back to the shot, okay? So we've got that 50mm lens, shallow focus, the mystery, the symbolisms of Chagall, okay? He's also placed in complete juxtaposition with the blue-eyed, blonde-haired, young American cop with his kind of like nice complexion and his kind of facial features and his cop's uniform, pristine. Chagall is placed in direct juxtaposition or opposition to him. So we understand that there's something about Chagall again, which is not American, which is other in that sense, compared to the police officer. In terms of the cinematography and the movement, we get this really, really, really slow creeping track shot, okay, just moving slowly in all the time on the police officer. And what that does is creates this real sense of tension, a real sense of suspense that's almost
That's so implicit, the audience might not even notice it. It's just creeping in. And it's almost as if the walls are just very, very slowly closing in around this character. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of the great films of this time, and specifically those 3 films that were released in 2007, No Country for Old Men, There Will Be Blood, Zodiac, 3 masterpieces all released within months of each other, which is just phenomenal, is they all of them utilize this technique, this very, very slow creeping track. And it's as if at the time, something in the air, in the zeitgeist, the kind of cultural, socio-political climate, there was this sense that the world was starting to close in on America, that things were becoming very, very claustrophobic, that things were becoming very, very kind of paranoid, that there was just this fear seeping in through the edges. And I think this kind of slow-moving cinematography that just kind of starts to box in its characters very slowly, almost while they don't notice, I think is a real kind of nice metaphor for thinking about how Americans felt at the time. Okay, then we get Chigurh kind of takes the handcuffs off, manages to step out of them, and we get the big moment at the end of the shot, right, which is when the police officer says, diegetic dialogue, I've got it under control, and then immediately the handcuffs come over and he does not have it in control. So there's a great kind of dramatic irony at play there. But also this again speaks to the covert political ideology of the film, the idea that Americans at this point, or just before this point, just before 9/11 maybe, who felt that they had the entire, everything under control, that everything was fine, that everything was playing into their hands, that they were in control of everything, and then 9/11 just comes out of nowhere and kind of completely smashes that apart. We have that crystallized in this scene. That's what happens. You can even take that metaphor and that idea slightly further. If you think about the fact that it's the police officer's own handcuffs, in terms of mise-en-scène and props, it's the police officer's own handcuffs that kill violently the police officer himself. Chigurh uses them. The idea that that Chigurh is using something that belongs to the police officer, belongs to America, in order to kind of commit these acts of violence. We can link that ideologically maybe to some ideas about what was going on with America, foreign policy, Al-Qaeda in the 80s. Because remember, Al-Qaeda were armed and trained by the CIA. Okay, so and that's fact. They were armed and trained by the CIA to fight the Soviets. Okay, and then Al-Qaeda over the years distanced themselves from America, distanced themselves from the CIA, formed their own kind of ideas, philosophies, their kind of very horrifying philosophies, and then they attacked America, 9/11, and then various other terrorist attacks, using the training, using the weaponry, using the financial support that they'd got from America, started getting from America in the 80s. So America were attacked by their own training, their own wealth, their own weaponry in that sense. And so you could argue that when Chigurh uses the police officer's own handcuffs to kind of attack him violently out of nowhere, well, of course, because this is what happened to America during that period of 9/11, which is really interesting to think about. And it hints at this American hypocrisy again. Americans being surprised at this random act of violence. Well, it's not really random if you follow the political kind of channels all the way back to the 1980s. And maybe that's why the film itself is set in 1980 as well, because what happened there in the 1980s has resonated all the way up until and past 9/11 in 2007 when the film is made. Then we get one of the most famous shots in the opening sequence, one of the most famous shots maybe in the entire kind of oeuvre of the Coen Brothers, right, which is the shot of all of the marks that the police officer's boots have made on the ground as he was strangled to death by Chigurh. And the camera lingers on it for a few seconds before Chigurh's boots come back in and the camera follows them. So the Coen Brothers clearly want us to kind of take note of this kind of random pattern of boot marks that have been left behind, and it's within the composition it takes up the entire frame, and it's almost framed in that 2:3:5 aspect ratio. It's like a piece of art. Okay, and there's a number of things we can say about that. We could argue that this is an intertextual reference, that this is a direct reference to works of surrealist art, to works of kind of like art that were kind of almost randomly generated. And I think most specifically, it looks like the work of Jackson Pollock, okay, the painter who would kind of throw paint at giant canvases and let the paint go where it went to create these kind of chaotic, random works of art. And one of the most interesting things about works of postmodernist, surrealist art is that we're trying to look at it and make sense of it. We're trying to find meaning in the madness, okay? And I think that's what the Coen Brothers are inviting us to do philosophically, ideologically, in general, with No Country for Old Men, which is they're showing us random and chaotic acts of violence, of things that don't necessarily have cause and effect. You know, the car crash at the end that just comes out of nowhere, the idea that Moss goes to do a good thing and then he's hunted down by these people, the idea that just because this happens doesn't necessarily mean that this will happen. If you are good, it doesn't necessarily mean that good things will happen to you. If you are bad, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know justice will be served to you. This is a chaotic world. And I think by introducing this idea through this kind of reference to Pollock's art, this idea that we're trying to make meaning out of chaos, speaks to a very human thing. It's why we like cinema, right? Because cinema narrativizes everything. Cinema organizes everything and gives us patterns and structures. When we watch a film, we're going in there to try and get some sense of reason and kind of pattern and structure, because life doesn't have that. When we go to see a film, we understand that the good guy is going to do good things and will then receive good things in return. And that makes us feel warm and secure and safe, and like there's some kind of, you know, universal moral justice in the world. And we also understand when we go to the cinema that the bad guy will do bad things, but he will be punished for that in some kind of way towards the end of the film. And what the Coen Brothers attempt to do with No Country for Old Men is just say that is not how the world works. There's no divine justice. There's no sense of pattern or rhyme or reason in life. Life is chaos. The universe is chaos. The universe doesn't care about us, unfortunately. We've narcissistically placed ourselves at the centre of the universe in the same way that Bell has. Remember Bell? I was expecting God to come into my life and he didn't. You know, as if to say, well, I'm the centre of the universe. Why has God not come to me? Right? That's the way that we think. That we're narcissistically at the centre of the universe and that the universe is there to make meaning for us. That it will provide us answers and structure and pattern. It doesn't. It doesn't. Good things don't necessarily happen to good people, and bad things don't necessarily happen to bad people. We don't like that. It's why we like cinema. And the Coen Brothers are forcing us to reckon with that in No Country for Old Men a little bit. And so they give us this kind of reference to a piece of art that we're desperate to make meaning of, but we can't find any meaning in it anyway. And it hints to their kind of wider ideological philosophies about the universe, which is that it's chaos. It doesn't care about us. And we have to find our own meaning in this chaos, because if we don't, then we're in trouble. That's a very postmodern way of thinking. You can go all the way back to the work of Jean-Luc Godard for that idea that that kind of existential postmodern idea that there's no inherent meaning in the universe. There's no inherent meaning there for us to find. We have to apply some kind of meaning, and that's the same thing that audiences did with the work of Pollock, looking at the chaos and trying to find meaning. And it's the kind of thing that we have to do with No Country, which is to look at the chaos and try and find meaning. And maybe the joke is on us. Maybe there is no meaning in No Country for Old Men, or maybe there is this covert ideological political idea that's running through it, but we're going to have to work to find it. And I think we can start with that kind of mid-shot of the boot marks, and we can lead all the way back up to that point. And the final thing about the boot marks we could say is that the film is obsessed with the connection between the ground and ourselves, with boots on the ground. It's obsessed by that. Constant references, characters taking off boots, putting them on, finding boots, using boots, taking them off. Our connection to the ground is very important around us, and the marks that we leave behind, I think, are incredibly important in this film too, and that's what we see here in a literal sense as well.
Final thing I just want to talk about is the diegetic dialogue that connects Chigurh and Moss, that first introduction to Moss at the end of this kind of opening sequence. And it's a piece of dialogue that connects the two together. We have Chigurh say, "Could you just hold still?" And then he kills his prey. And then we cut to Moss at one with the landscape within the mise-en-scène. Again, we just talked about boots, his boots with the gun resting on the boots, hunting the deer, and he says, "Hold still." So a line of dialogue that kind of somehow philosophically, universally, emotionally, spiritually connects these two characters together in two separate places. But when he shoots, he misses. And as he misses, and the deer's run into the landscape, we have this kind of shadow of this cloud just kind of creep its way across the American landscape towards Moss. And in that use of diegetic dialogue that connects the two characters together, we forge a connection between them. But we also understand, the Coen Brothers are being subtle about it, we understand who's going to win, who's going to lose. Okay, Chigurh will get away with this. Chigurh will kind of accomplish what he needs to accomplish to a certain extent. Moss will not. Moss will not. He shoots and he misses. And in those kind of those two little actions, that straight cut to a different location, the use of diegetic dialogue to connect the two kind of characters together, we understand narratively then where this film is headed.